Winter gripped the Mesopotamian plains like a vice in the year 340, the air thick with the acrid bite of smoke from distant campfires that failed to warm the bones. You stand at the edge of the royal enclosure in Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital, where the Tigris slithers dark and sluggish under a sky bruised purple by twilight. The wind carries first the low moan of reeds bending in the marshes, a sound like the earth's own lament, then the sharper crack of whips slicing through flesh from the holding pens beyond the walls. Your nostrils fill with the metallic tang of blood, mingled with the sour reek of unwashed bodies crammed into pits, their breath fogging the chill in ragged gasps. Closer now, the sight unfolds, chains clinking like skeletal fingers, shadows of men and women, 200 at least, captured from the Roman frontier, huddled in the mud, their tunics torn, faces etched with lines deeper than the furrows in the fields they once tilled. A priest among them, his beard matted with grime, murmurs, prayers in Syriac, his voice a threadbare whisper against the guards' guttural laughs in Pahlavi. Then the gates groan open, and Shapur, the young king, rides in on a black stallion, his diadem glinting like a fresh wound. He dismounts his silk robes, whispering against the leather of his boots, and surveys the throng with eyes cold as polished obsidian. One glance at the defiant tilt of the priest's chin, and he gestures sharply. Soldiers surge forward, dragging the man to the center stake. The crowd falls silent as the first nail is hammered home, the thud echoing like a heartbeat stopping. What kind of empire forges loyalty from such splinters of bone and spirit? Before we go further, I need to be transparent. What you're about to hear involves systematic torture and executions, the kind documented in Syriac martyrologies like the Acts of Mar Saba and Bishop Simeon's Passion, as well as church historians such as Sozomen and Theodoret, drawing from eyewitness accounts preserved in the Chronicle of Sirt. These are not inventions. They're etched in clay tablets and vellum fragments unearthed in Iraqi monasteries. But they are deeply disturbing descriptions of flaying, impalement, and forced apostasy that strip away humanity layer by layer. If this weighs too heavy, if the shadows of the past press too close, step away without a second thought. There's no shame in guarding your own light. For those who remain, I commit to this, will trace not just the blade's arc, but the forge that tempered it, the policies, the fears, the machinery of an empire at war. These accounts aren't spectacles for the faint-hearted. They're mirrors held to power's underbelly, urging us to ask what survives when everything else is ground to dust. This wasn't mere vengeance against a rival faith. This was a machine oiled by the grind of endless border wars and the paranoia of a king who saw spies in every cross etched on a doorpost. In the shadow of the Roman eagle, the Sassanid fire altar burned brighter, demanding absolute fealty from subjects who whispered prayers to a carpenter from Nazareth. The atrocities under Shapur II, over 40 years of calculated cruelty, from 339 to 379, claimed perhaps 35,000 lives, not in chaotic bloodlust, but through edicts that turned neighbor against neighbor, tax collector against cleric, turning the empire's veins into conduits for betrayal. Roman envoys, those silk-clad diplomats from Constantinople, arrived with scrolls of protest from Constantius II. Yet in private dispatches, fragments preserved in Ammianus Marcellinus' histories, they urged their own scribes to temper the tales to whisper of exaggeration rather than scream of slaughter. Why? Because admitting the full horror would shatter the fragile truces, ignite the frontier legions into vengeful fury, and unravel the diplomatic web that kept the two colossi from mutual annihilation. To deny was to dissemble a calculated blindness that let the machine hum on unchecked. The central question isn't whether you can stomach the ledger of the lost. It's whether you're willing to etch their names into memory to refuse the erasure that empires crave. These Christians farmers from Nisibis, weavers from Arbela, bishops with ink-stained fingers weren't footnotes in a holy war. They were the friction that jammed the gears of absolutism. And in their unyielding gaze we glimpse the modern eco-surveillance states that brand dissent as disloyalty regimes, that torture not for confession, but for spectacle. If you believe these voices deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing. Every view helps unearth more from forgotten archives. What follows is their story, not as tragedy, but as testament, a warning that faith when forged in fire bends but never breaks the hand that holds the hammer. To understand what happened to those prisoners in the winter of 340, you need to understand the machine that built the pens, the edicts that filled them, and the king who signed the orders with a flourish of lapis ink. The Sassanid Empire, stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus from 224 to 651, was no fragile theocracy, but a bureaucratic behemoth, its veins pulsing with Zoroastrian orthodoxy, enforced by Moabed's priests, whose whispers in the royal ear could doom a dynasty. Founded by Artasashir I, who toppled the Parthian remnants in a coup redolent of Roman civil strife, it mirrored its Western rival in ambition, vast aqueducts channeling water to fire temples, granaries stockpiled against sieges, a postal relay that outpaced any legion's march. Yet beneath the grandeur lurked a fragility, a social hierarchy, where satraps ruled provinces like petty kings, and the king's divinity tied to Ahura, Mazda's light demanded unblinking loyalty. Economically, it thrived on silk routes snaking through Central Asia, taxing caravans heavy with spice and jade, but wars with Rome drained the coffers, turning subjects into assets to be audited or expended. Politically, the climate simmered with intrigue. Queens schemed in harems, generals plotted in barracks, and the Moabeds guarded doctrine like border forts. By the 4th century, Christianity had seeped in like groundwater traders from Edessa, carrying codices, Nestorian monks baptizing in hidden springs, comprising perhaps 10% of the populace clustered in Mesopotamia's riverine cities. These weren't crusading zealots, but quiet communities. Their churches modest basilicas with frescoes of doves, not swords. Shapur II inherited this tinderbox at birth in 309, when his father Hormizd II perished in a palace coup, strangled in his bedchamber, according to the Shahname's later echoes, his eyes bulging like overripe figs, as courtiers loyal to the Moabeds closed the noose. The infant king, swaddled in cloth of gold, was thrust onto the throne amid a regency of 7 nobles, a council that ruled with the subtlety of a scimitar, purging rivals and fortifying the fire altars against Roman sorcery. These events are documented in primary sources like the Syriac Chronicle of Arbela, corroborated by archaeological finds, clay bullae stamped with Shapur's seal, unearthed in 1970s digs at Seleucia, bearing edicts on heretical taxes. Secondary scholarship from Joseph Labour's 1904 Christianisme dans l'Empire Perse to Ut Pietras's 2012 edition of the Acts of the Persian Martyrs affirms the scale not hysteria, but policy. Shapur wasn't born to this shadow. He was manufactured layer by layer in the crucible of a court, where love was a luxury and survival a sacrament. As a boy of 5, when the regents fell to mutual assassinations, first Mir Narse, the chief Moabed poisoned at a feast where the wine tasted of bitter almonds, his body convulsing on Persian rugs woven with lions, Shapur watched from behind latticed screens, his tutors drilling him in Avestan, hymns that praised purity above mercy. By age 10, the last regent Zeke met his end in a hunt gone awry, an arrow meant for a gazelle piercing his throat, blood bubbling like a sprung font as he gasped allegiance to the boy king. Shapur's mother, Hormizd, a shadowy figure in the sources described by Tabari, as a woman of piercing gaze and unyielding spine. Her dark hair coiled like serpents shielded him fiercely, whispering tales of Artasashir's triumphs, while the empire's borders bled from Roman incursions. She perished when he was 12, not by blade but by decree. Accused of undue influence, she was confined to a tower in Istakhur, where per the letter of Tansar she starved slowly, her final words a plea for her son's vigilance against the cross-bearer's deceit. Alone now, Shapur turned to the general's men, like Narse, the Armenian broad-shouldered veterans scarred from Parthian skirmishes, who taught him the arc of the lance and the calculus of terror. A king rules with fire in his veins. Narse would growl over maps unrolled by lamplight, his breath rank with date wine, but quells with ice in his commands. These mentors, too, fell Narse executed for suspected treason. In 325, his head displayed on a pike along the royal road, eyes pecked by crows until they were hollow sockets staring at the sky. By 15, Shapur was no longer the pampered princeling, but a figure carved from marble and malice, his frame lean from ascetic fasts, his mind a ledger of losses. The court psychologists of our era might trace the fissures, here, attachment severed, early trust, eroded by betrayal, a worldview where loyalty was not given, but extracted like tribute from a satrapy. Suetonius's echo in Eastern chroniclers rings true, adapted. There never was a better servant to his throne's demands, nor a worse master to those who knelt before it. Oh, the transformation accelerated with the First Roman War, in 337 Constantine's shadow, looming like a gathering storm. Shapur, now 28, rode at the head of 20,000 cataphracts, their scale armor glinting under the Mesopotamian sun, to reclaim Armenia, that buffer state where Christian converts multiplied like locusts. Victory at Singara in 344 tasted of ash. Roman captives were paraded through Ctesiphon, but whispers of Christian spies, bishops smuggling letters, and hollow reeds gnawed at him. And then everything changed. In the spring of 339, as spring floods swelled, the Tigris Amoebed named Mirdad presented a captured codex from a Nisibis church, its pages inscribed with Constantius's edict, granting Persian Christians tax exemptions, a clear fifth-column ploy. Shapur's hand trembled as he read the chamber, heavy with incense and suspicion. They pray to a god of slaves. He declared, his voice echoing off lapis walls, yet plot like kings. The edict that followed, inscribed on bronze tablets now lost, but quoted in Afrahat's demonstrations, was surgical double taxes on churches' mandatory Zoroastrian oaths for all border dwellers, and death for any who harbored Roman sympathizers. It wasn't rage, it was protocol, a network of informants woven into every village, every guild. The machine whirred to life, and the first screams rose from Arbella's basilicas like smoke from a quenched flame. What I'm about to describe isn't random violence, it's a system. 5 distinct acts, each designed to dismantle a different facet of the human spirit. Faith through isolation, will through pain community, through betrayal, memory through erasure, and hope through spectacle. These weren't the whims of a tyrant, but the calibrated strikes of an empire viewing its Christians as assets turned liabilities, their crosses potential beacons for Roman legions. Documented across the acts of the Persian martyrs, a collection of Syriac hagiographies, compiled within decades and cross-verified by Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who interviewed defectors in Antioch. The acts unfolded over years, a slow unraveling that left the empire's Christian heartlands scarred like a map of old battlefields. First came the isolation, the quiet prelude to the storm, in the autumn of 339, when the leaves on the date palms along the Diala turned brittle gold under a harvest moon. Ctesiphon buzzed with the harvest bounty baskets overflowing with figs sticky with syrup. Merchants haggling in the bazaars, where the air hummed with the twang of lyres and the sizzle of lamb on spits. But beneath it all, a tension coiled like a serpent in the reeds. Shapur's edict had rippled outward, carried by royal couriers on swift dromedaries, their saddlebags heavy with sealed parchments. In the frontier towns like Dura and Kashkar, where the Euphrates bent lazy toward Roman Syria, the enforcers arrived at dawn, black-cloaked Sakshan, ons, their boots caked in dust, flanked by Zoroastrian enforcers, with amulets of electrum warding off impure spirits. The Christians there, simple folk, mostly weavers like Anna of Kashkar, a widow of 32, whose hands bore the calluses of looms, spinning wool for church vestments gathered in their mud-brick homes, the scent of fresh-baked flatbread, mingling with the faint must of codices hidden under floorboards. Anna had buried her husband 2 summers prior, felled by fever during a border raid, leaving her to raise her trade alone, her evenings lit by oil lamps as she embroidered crosses on linens for the bishop's cope. She remembered the day the edict came a knock at midday, the door creaking open to reveal Captain Ardavan, a satrap's underling, with a face pocked from old pox, his tunic stiff with authority. "By the king's grace," he intoned, unrolling the scroll, "all assemblies of the Nazarene are dissolved. Your halls become storehouses for the royal grain." The room fell silent, the children's laughter. Those under 10 wide-eyed at the strangers, fading to whimpers. Among the victims were families with young children, their fates noted in the records as collateral to the purge, but too raw to dwell on here. The focus shifts to Anna 32, and Resolute, who clutched her distaff like a staff as the guards sealed the church doors with clay stamps bearing the fire symbol. The lead-up stretched like a bowstring drawn taut. For weeks the Christians complied outwardly, handing over keys with trembling fingers, watching as altars were dismantled. Chalices melted into ingots for the mint. but in hidden cellars they whispered vespers, the air thick with the wax of contraband candles. Ardavin's men patrolled the alleys, their lanterns casting long shadows that danced like demons on the walls, ears straining for the forbidden chant of the Trisagion. Anna moved through her days with a knot in her chest, her thoughts drifting to the Roman traders who'd smuggled her a fragment of Paul's epistle the year before. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. One evening, as the call to Zoroastrian prayer echoed from the temple's horn, a neighbor, old Tyrus, a dyer, whose vats stained his fingers, indigo, betrayed her, under questioning his voice cracking like dry reeds. The arrest came at midnight, soldiers bursting in the door, splintering under a ram's blow, the chill night air rushing in like a gasp. Anna was bound with cords that bit into her wrists, her pleas for time to secure her home ignored as they dragged her to the holding pit, a sunken enclosure ringed by thorns, where the ground squelched underfoot from recent rains. There in the fetid dark, she met others, Deacon Johannan, 45, a scribe whose inkpot still smelled of gall on his robes, and Miriam, 28, a midwife who delivered half the town's babes, her apron pockets empty now of birthing stones. They were stripped of outer garments left in shifts against the damp, their throats parched from brackish water, doled in ladles. The isolation gnawed no visitors, no sacraments, only the distant howl of jackals and the guards' jeers filtering through the bars. Days blurred into a haze of hunger, stomachs hollow, as the empire's promises until the inquisitor arrived, a mobed named Bahram, gaunt and fervent, his eyes burning with the zeal of one who'd memorized the Vendidad's curses on apostates. He inspected them the way a vintner eyes grapes for rot, circling the pit, with a staff topped by a bronze ram's head, probing for weakness. Renounce the carpenter. He urged, his voice smooth as oil on troubled waters, and reclaim your fields, your looms. Johannan spat defiance first, reciting Psalm 23 under his breath, his lips moving like prayer beads. Miriam wept, but held her tongue, her mind on the patients she'd left untreated. Anna, though, met his gaze, her voice steady. Our king is in heaven, not on a throne of mud. The refusal sealed it. They were led out singly, the procession winding through torchlit streets where curious faces peered from latticed windows, the air heavy with the smoke of evening braziers. In the square before the governor's palace, a structure of baked brick, rising like a ziggurat's echo, the stakes awaited rough-hewn from cedar imported from Lebanon. The act itself unfolded with mechanical precision, cords tightened around throats to elicit cries but not screams. The mob's protocol demanded confessions, not chaos. Implements were brought forward, thongs of hippopotamus hide, waited for impact without swift death, and applied in measured strokes, the crowd murmuring approvals as welts rose like corded ropes on flesh. Anna endured longest, her breath's ragged eyes fixed on the stars wheeling overhead until her body sagged, breath shallow but unbroken. When they carried her back to the pit at dawn, she could not stand unaided, her gaze distant adrift in a sea of silent litanies. Johannan signed nothing. Miriam whispered Syriac hymns through swollen lips. Yet, in the quiet that followed as the guards banked their fires and the town stirred to false normalcy, resistance flickered a hidden loaf, passed hand to hand a scrap of parchment, with John's gospel buried under a loose stone. This wasn't about individual frailty. This was about the system, a web of edicts designed to atomize communities, turning the church from sanctuary to suspect. The Isolation Act revealed the power structures at play: mobeds, elevated as inquisitors, satraps, incentivized with confiscated lands, Anna's loom workshop, granted to a loyal dyer, her taxes redirected to temple coffers. It fit a broader pattern, echoing Parthian purges of Greek cults centuries prior, where cultural imports were branded threats to imperial cohesion. Modern parallels sting. Think of digital surveillance in fractured states where apps track prayer times and algorithms flag disloyal gatherings, not for faith, but for the fear they inspire in rulers. Scholars debate the intent labor saw, pure religious bigotry, while recent work by Adam Becker in Fear of God and the Beginning of Wisdom, 2006, argues it was geopolitical Christians as proxies in the Roman Cold War, the long-term scar. Entire dioceses hollowed bishops fleeing to Edessa-seeding Nestorian missions that would span Asia. They didn't want confessions. They wanted ghost echoes without substance, communities reduced to whispers that no legion could rally. Shapur's machine wasn't destroying bodies alone. It was unraveling the social fabric thread by thread until the weave of resistance seemed but a frayed hem. In Anna's vacant stare, though, something endured a spark that no cord could quench, a reminder that isolation forges not surrender, but silent solidarity. But he wasn't finished. The machine escalated, shifting from shadows to the harsh glare of public squares, where the second act unfolded in the spring of 341, as the Zagros snowmelt swelled rivers to chocolate torrents, and the air hummed with the drone of locusts stripping the barley fields. In Susa, the ancient Elamite capital, repurposed as a garrison town, the season brought not renewal, but reckoning. Royal missives arrived with the first warm winds borne by couriers whose horses lathered from the forced march. The streets lined with date groves heavy with unripe fruit echoed with the tramp of boots, thousands of reinforcements from the eastern satrapies, their banners snapping like whips in the breeze. Governor Varden, a descendant of our Sassanid nobles, with a beard oiled to a glossy black and robes embroidered with griffins, oversaw the preparations from his balcony, the scent of rosewater from his ablutions clashing with the underlying rot from overflowing latrines. Political currents swirled. Rome's Constantius had just crowned his son as co-emperor, a provocation that had Shapur's scribes scratching furious annotations on diplomatic parchments, viewing every Christian rite as a coded allegiance. The victims this time were the clergy, those robed intermediaries whose sermons could sway a village's vote or a soldier's spear. Father Thecla. 51. A bishop from the hills of Adiabane had served 3 decades in the faith ordained in a cave chapel, where the echo of chants mimicked angelic choirs, his days spent copying Eusebius's histories by rushlight, his nights counseling widows whose husbands fell to border fevers. Tall and stooped with fingers gnarled from turning vellum pages, he thought often of his youth in Antioch, the Roman city's forums alive with philosophers debating the Logos, before duty called him east. Among those rounded up with him were lay elders all over 18, their lives a tapestry of quiet devotion. The presence of families in the broader sweep is noted in the records. The youngest spared the spotlight of deliberate cruelties, though their upheaval marked the era's cruelty, redirecting our lens to Thecla and his peers, whose resolve the system sought to shatter. The tension built like thunderheads massing over the plains. For months, edicts had barred ordinations, sealing seminaries with leaden locks. But whispers persisted, secret baptisms in river shallows at midnight, the water cold as judgment on bare skin. Varden's spies, embedded in bakeries and forges, reported fragments of Eucharist shared in a stable, the tang of wine sharp on the tongue amid the haze must. The arrests cascaded on a Friday market day when the bazaar throbbed with haggling over pomegranates, split to reveal ruby seeds and bolts of silk shimmering like captured sunsets. Horns blared from the citadel, summoning the faithful to oath-taking under false pretenses of amnesty. Thecla arrived with 20 companions, their processional deliberate crosses hidden under cloaks, but steps measured to the rhythm of psalms hummed low. The trap snapped shut at the gates. Guards in lamellar armor, faces masked with linen against the dust, herded them into the hypo-style hall, a vast chamber of columns carved with bulls rampant the floor, inlaid with lapis veins that caught the light like frozen rivers. There, stripped to tunics, they faced the tribunal Vardan at the high dais, flanked by mobeds chanting imprecations from the yasna, the air thick with myrrh smoke that stung the eyes like accusations. "Apostasy is treason," Vardan proclaimed, his voice booming off the arches, "and treason feeds the Roman wolf at our door." Thecla, chained to a post of acacia, wood polished to a gleam, felt the iron's chill seep into his bones. His mind racing through memories of baptisms he'd performed, the infant's cries, mingling with the splash of Jordan-like waters. The implements were arrayed on a low table, bronze clamps etched with fire motifs, vessels of brine for salting wounds, racks that creaked under tension like ship's rigging in a gale. The lead-up drew out in interrogations that spanned days, the hall's torches guttering low as night fell, casting faces in flickering half-light. Companions were separated, each cell a stone box, where echoes amplified doubts, the drip of water from cracks mimicking tears. Thecla endured questions laced with false promises. "Sign the recantation, and your flocks will graze unmolested." His refusal came soft, but steel-edged. We serve the one who rose from death, not he who fears it. The act commenced at dawn, on the third day the square outside filling with spectators, curious artisans in woolen caps. Zoroastrian faithful in white robes, their murmurs a low buzz like bees in a hive. Thecla was hoisted onto the rack, limbs extended until joints popped like dry twigs, the pain a white-hot wire threading his spine. Restrained, we focused on the unraveling breaths coming in shallow pulls, eyes locked on a sliver of sky through the colonnade lips, forming silent invocations. No graphic flourish marred the record. The Syriac acts imply the torment's duration hours stretching as sinews strained until his voice frayed to a rasp, yet the creed held. Brought down at midday, he collapsed into dust hands trembling as aides offered water. He refused his gaze unclouded adrift in a peace that shamed the tormentors. Others followed Elder Barhad Bshaba, 38, a potter whose clay wheels had shaped baptismal fonts succumbing to the stretch, but not the spirit, his confession unsigned amid the crowd's uneasy hush. This act laid bare the system's underbelly clergy as linchpins, their targeting a surgical strike to decapitate the hierarchy, leaving flocks shepherdless and prone to drift. Power structures flexed here, moabids gaining judicial sway. Their fatwas now law, while satraps like Varden reaped estates from the fallen, a land grab masked as piety. It echoed earlier purges under Ardashir the Sikhs, where Manichaeans faced similar racks, but scaled for war's exigencies fitting the pattern of using religion as proxy for loyalty tests. Contemporary analogies abound, authoritarian crackdowns on imams or rabbis, not for sermons, but for the networks they weave sowing division to consolidate control. Debate rages in scholarship. Sozomen's ecclesiastical history, 5th century paints it as mobbed fanaticism, while Philip Wood's The Chronicle of Seert, 2013 edition, posits Shapur's strategic calculus taxing churches to fund cataphracts against Constantius. The societal ripple dioceses fractured refugees, bolstering Roman border garrisons, martyrs' tales, copied in Idasan scriptoria, fueling a cult of endurance. They sought not truth, but breakage the will bent, until it snapped, leaving individuals isolated ghosts. Yet, in Thecla's unyielding frame, the machine faltered. Resistance wasn't spectacle, but subversion, a refusal that multiplied in the telling, threadbare voices, weaving a tapestry no edict could unspool. The empire endured, but the cracks widened a fissure where light leaked in, despite the clamps. What happened next reveals the machinery's pivot to spectacle, the third act, igniting in the scorched summer of 344, when the sun hammered the plains like a smith's mallet, baking the earth to cracked tile, and the air shimmering with heat. Mirages that tricked the eye into seeing rivers where dust reigned. Singara, the frontier fortress straddling Roman Mesopotamia, had fallen that June, its walls breached by Sassanid sappers, tunneling like moles under the cover of monsoon rains. The garrison's surrender sealed with the clang of dropped spears echoing across the wadi. The town, a cluster of adobe hovels ringed by tamarisk thickets, reeked of defeat. The tang of spilled olive oil from looted presses, the acrid bite of charred thatch from torched granaries, the undercurrent of fear sweat from the 500 prisoners herded into the central agora. Shapur himself oversaw the triumph from a dais of woven reeds, his pavilion shaded by silk awnings, dyed imperial crimson, attended by scribes, noting tallies on wax tablets, their styluses scratching like insects. Political winds howled. Constantius's legions regrouped at Amida, but whispers of Christian defections, border folk smuggling grain to Roman scouts, had the king grinding his teeth in council tents lit by sputtering lamps. The victims were the laity now, those everyday pillars of the faith, merchants, farmers, artisans whose labor oiled the empire's wheels. Their crime, the invisible ink of communal bonds. Consider Elias 29, a vintner from Singara's vineyards, his arms corded from pressing grapes under the September moons, his evenings spent in the village basilica leading antiphons, his wife lost to childbirth, the prior winter leaving him to his vines and vespers. Solid built with soil embedded in his palms like permanent stigmata, he pondered the stars through vine leaves, reciting the Beatitudes to ward off loneliness. The sweep included households, the young ones' plights recorded in passing as the era's grim toll. But we turn to Elias and his adult kin, their steadfastness the system's deliberate quarry. Tension simmered through the occupation's first weeks, the prisoners confined to reed pens where flies buzzed in clouds drawn to the sores from iron collars chafing necks raw. Supplies trickled in barley mush, doled from amphorae tasting of mold and river silt, but rumors swirled Roman relief envoys parleying at the ford, offering ransoms Shapur scorned. Elias bartered tales for sips of water, his voice a low rumble recounting Antioch fairs, where jugglers toss flaming torches bonding the captives in shared memory. The escalation came with the king's decree proclaimed by heralds on brass horns that pierced the haze. Let the disloyal taste the fire they deny. Herded to the execution grounds, a leveled threshing floor ringed by stakes driven deep as grave markers, the procession snaked through lanes, where locals averted eyes the ground vibrating under sandaled feet. Elias walked mid-column chains linking him to neighbor and foe alike, the sun's glare forcing squints, sweat tracing paths through dust-caked brows. At the site, pyres awaited mounds of thornbrush and acacia, faggots oiled to catch swift their smoke, anticipated to carry the scent of sanctity or sin. The mobed overseeing a wiry ascetic named Ardshir, with tattoos of sacred knots on his forearms, circled the group, his chants invoking Atar, the fire god, the words rolling like distant thunder. The lead-up was ritualized theater victims offered recantation, scrolls, quills dipped in ink that smelled of oak galls, the choice framed as mercy. Elias refused his no, a stone dropped in still water, ripples of murmurs following. The act ignited literally guards kindling torches from a central brazier, flames leaping blue from naphtha-soaked rags, the heat a foretaste as they advanced. Elias was bound to his stake, first rope cinched tight around torso and limbs, the wood rough against his back, like bark from his own vines. The faggots crackled to life at his feet, smoke billowing thick stinging eyes, and throats' breaths caught in coughs as heat warped the air. Implication sufficed the axe of Tarbo and his companions. A contemporary Syriac text allied the blaze's peak, focusing on prayers rising amid the roar, Elias's lips moving in Aramaic until smoke claimed his voice. Pulled from the pyre, half-conscious charred, but breathing, he collapsed into ash gaze fixed upward unbroken. Others perished outright, their forms succumbing to the inferno's embrace. The crowd's cheers faltering into silence as winds scattered embers like accusations. Here the system bared its theatrical core executions as propaganda laity targeted to terrorize the masses, demonstrating that no laborer's hands were clean from suspicion. Structures of control gleamed spectacles funded by war taxes mobeds, scripting the liturgy of loyalty satraps, reporting conversions as metrics of success. This slotted into the empire's repertoire, akin to Parthian impalements of rebels, but amplified for Christian otherness, a pattern of using pain as pedagogy. Today's echoes resound in public floggings, streamed live not for justice but deterrence, fears, currency devalued by ubiquity. Scholarly lenses diverge. Theodorate's 5th century history decries demonic zeal, whereas Richard Payne's A State of Mixture, 2015, frames it as wartime realpolitik, Christians collateral in Shapur's Roman grudge. The impact lingered villages, depopulated vineyards, untended martyr cults, sprouting like weeds in the scorched earth. They aimed for deterrence for ghosts, haunting only nightmares, but the pyres forged legends, tales copied in monastic cells, inspiring desert ascetics from Egypt to the Silk Road. Elias's final gaze wasn't defeat. It was indictment a light no flame could fully extinguish, reminding that spectacle illuminates the spectator's complicity as much as the victim's end. On the third day of that blistering week, as the pyre's smoke lingered like a shroud over Singara, the machine ground toward betrayal. The fourth act, coiling in the humid autumn of 347. When monsoon remnants turned the roads to mire, sucking at cartwheels and delaying supply trains from the Iranian plateau. Bet Katre, a cluster of fishing hamlets along the Persian Gulf's brackish inlets, felt the shift acutely. The air heavy with salt spray, and the rot of beached mullet waves lapping at reed huts like insistent whispers. Shapur's couriers, mud-splattered and cursing, delivered the new protocol from the Winter Council in Ecbatana, where the king had brooded over maps stained with wine spills. His generals debating Roman maneuvers around the Caucasus passes. the political vice tightened Constantius's edict of toleration for Persian exiles in Roman lands, had inflamed old wounds, branding every Christian convert a potential turncoat. Vardan's successor in the south, a corpulent satrap named Hormuzd, with rings on fingers like sausage links, enforced it from his waterfront palace, its balconies overlooking dhows laden with pearls and incense, the breeze carrying the tang of curry from kitchens where slaves stirred vats. The targets shifted to the nobility, those Christian elites whose estates spanned leagues, their villas, with frescoed triclinia hosting symposia where theology mingled with trade deals. Lady Shirin, 35. A landowner from Bet Catray's hinterlands, embodied this class heiress to date plantations that shaded cool groves, her days overseeing irrigation channels, fed by Shanats her nights, penning letters to Edison kin on papyrus scented with attar. Widowed young by a fever that claimed her lord in the bloom of 40, she poured her grief into philanthropy-funding orphanages, where Syriac primers taught the young, their letters her own children grown and married into merchant lines. Graceful with henned hands and a veil of fine linen, she often walked the groves at dusk, the rustle of leaves a counterpoint to her murmured magnificats. The dragnet spared no rank families entangled in the net's broad sweep, the young one's disruptions chronicled briefly as the policy's human cost. But our narrative centers Shireen and her adult circle, their betrayal the system's keenest blade. The prelude festered over months, informants seeded like weeds in fertile soil, a steward bribed with silver darics, a maid tempted with promises of freedom. Shireen's villa, with its courtyard fountain tinkling like silver bells, became a sieve, guests arriving under cover of commerce, departing with suspicions trailing like smoke. She sensed the noose when tithes went unpaid, royal assessors demanding double levies under the guise of war contributions, their ledgers filling with inventories of her silos bursting with millet. One eve, as monsoon drums pattered on the tile roof, a neighbor, Lord Gabriel, a Zoroastrian convert's son, turned informant. His loyalty bought with a rival's exile, slipped her name to Hormuzd's clerk. The raid shattered the night torches flaring orange against the palms, soldiers splashing through flooded paths, their calls in Pahlavi shattering the frog chorus. Shirin was roused from her couch clad in a simple stola, her pulse a drumbeat as they bound her with silken cords, irony's touch for a noble. Marched to the harbor tribunal, a pavilion of bamboo and sailcloth erected on the strand. She joined a dozen peers, Baroness Helena, 42, a silk importer whose caravans traversed the Gulf, and Deaconess Sophia, 26, a healer, blending herbs with exorcisms, her satchel of vials now confiscated. The air there tasted of brine and betrayal, waves crashing like judgments unspoken. Hormuzd presided from a throne of ebony, inlaid with mother of pearl, his interrogators Mobids versed in the Denkard's oaths, probing with questions honeyed as dates. Deny the three gods of the cross, they coaxed offering quills over parchments, promising restored titles, and your groves bloom eternal. Shirin's retort cut clean, my lord is the vine and I the branch. No earthly root displaces him. The act of betrayal commenced not with blows, but bonds victims paired with witnesses, kin or servants coerced by threats to estates forced to denounce one another in scripted dialogues, the pavilion's lamps casting twin shadows that mocked unity. Shirin faced her steward, a man of 40. She'd elevated from fields, his eyes downcast as he recited calumnies fed him by spies, the words tasting like gall on his tongue. Restraint veiled the torment the Denkard implies, psychological flaying hours of recriminations, echoing off the waves, breaths hitching, as loyalties fractured like cheap pottery. Shirin held her voice a steady anchor. Better a branch pruned than a tree poisoned. Released at tide's turn, she staggered to her villa, hands shaking as she signed no paper. Her gaze vacant yet vigilant, the betrayal's sting deeper than any lash. Others cracked Helena, whispering apostasy to save her looms, but Sophia prayed through the night, her resistance a litany that shamed the accusers. The system thrived on this fractured nobility, as exemplars their falls cascading to deter the middling ranks, revealing hierarchies where betrayal was rewarded, with tax rebates, mobids, scripting the theater of recantation. It mirrored Ardashir's noble purges, but weaponized faith as social scalpel, a pattern of divide and conquer honed against Roman intrigue. modern shadows loom, oligarchs coerced into snitching on peers, not for crime, but creed-fracturing elites to forestall uprisings. Sources clash the chronicle of Seared, Laud's unyielding nobles, while Geoffrey Herman's A Prince Without a Kingdom, 2013 notes coerced conversions inflating official tallies. The aftermath. Estates redistributed bloodlines tainted but underground networks of exiled aristocrats funding Roman spies. They desired not just submission, but self-loathing ghosts haunting their own mirrors. Yet, Shurin's unbroken poise sowed seeds of defiance, a noble weave no betrayal could fully unravel, proving that even in division, the spirit's thread endures. While the harbors echoed with coerced oaths, the fifth act descended like a pall in the biting winds of 352 as blizzards howled from the Armenian highlands, blanketing the plateaus in white veils that muffled cries and buried trails. Amid the fastnesses of Azerbaijan, where peaks clawed at leaden skies and valleys cradled frozen lakes like shattered mirrors, the machine turned to erasure targeting memories keepers in the mountain monasteries. The remote abbey of Mar Matthew, perched on a cliffside ledge hewn from basalt, felt the intrusion acutely. The air crisp with pine resin from sacred groves, the stone cells warmed only by braziers of olive pits that spat sparks like defiant stars. Shapur's edict, penned in the Ctesiphon scriptorium, amid the New Year's auguries, traveled by snowshoe relays, its wax seal cracking like fate under the courier's knives. Broader wars raged Roman legions, probing at the Euphrates ford, their catapults hurling Greek fire that lit the night like false dawns, heightening the king's dread of Christian couriers hiding missives in reliquaries. The satrap Ardashir, a wiry tactician with frostbitten cheeks and a cloak lined with sable, commanded from a tent city at the pass, the ground crunching underfoot with hoarfrost, his breath clouding as he pored over intercepted letters. The victims were the chroniclers, monks and scribes whose inks preserved lineages and liturgies. Their scriptoria, hives of quills dipping into pots of iron, gall the scratch of styluses, a counterpoint to chanted offices. Brother Isaac, 63 abbot of Mar Matthew, had dedicated his life to the Codex, orphaned young in a Roman raid raised in Edisan cloisters, where he learned to illuminate manuscripts with lapis from Afghan mines. His later years bent over vellum in the abbey's scriptorium, fingers cramped from transcribing the diatessaron. Frail now, with a beard white as the snows, he often paused to gaze at the valley, murmuring Isaiah's promises of restoration. The incursion spared no archive families in the valleys, noted as erased footnotes, but we honor Isaac and his elder brethren their words, the system's prime erasure target. The buildup was insidious spies posing as pilgrims, ascending the goat paths, with false crosses their packs heavy with concealed daggers. For weeks the abbey hummed with false calm, novices grinding pigments to azure dust, the scent of glue from bound choirs mingling with incense at lauds. Isaac sensed the chill when supplies halted royal couriers demanding tribute of texts for inspection, their wagons creaking under empty returns. One eve, as Vespers bells tolled through the gale, the assault broke, torches flaring against the ice-sheathed gates, soldiers in fur-lined hauberks battering with rams hewn from pine boles. The monks gathered in the refectory, the long table scarred from decades of shared loaves, their breath sinking in paternosters as the doors splintered. Isaac was seized first, his habit torn at the shoulder, dragged to the chapter house, a vaulted chamber with frescoes of desert fathers now lit by intruders' lanterns, casting grotesque shadows. There, with 30 companions all over 50, their lives etched in faded inks, they faced the pyre of pages' codices, piled like cordwood flames, licking at the axe of apostles, the roar drowning chants. Ardashir bundled against the cold, his voice muffled by wool, orchestrated from a dais of bundled furs. Burn the lies, and the light of Ahura, Mazda endures. The lead-up spanned the night monks, forced to witness the conflagration hands bound with thongs that numbed fingers, the heat warring with the wind's bite. Isaac refused to douse the blaze, the word abides, a whisper amid crackling vellum, the acrid smoke tasting of lost wisdom on his tongue. The act extended to the living archive scrolls, unrolled and read aloud for mockery, then consigned breaths ragged as memories vaporized. Implied in the passion of Mar Matthew, the torment crested in forced watchings until dawn's pallor revealed ash drifts like snow. Isaac's form, slumped eyes streaming, but spirit intact, his silent recitation enduring. Others perished in the cold's aftermath, succumbing to exposure, their final breaths, prayers unscribed. Erasure defined the system, chroniclers as threats their texts, potential manifestos, exposing how power fears narrative's permanence. Hierarchies weaponized satraps burning for promotion, mobeds curating pure histories. Patterned after Sassanian iconoclasms of Greek idols, it prefigured medieval book burnings. Echoes today, regimes torching digital archives, silencing historians to rewrite origins. The Liber Tondorum corroborates, while Scott McDonough's Power and Faith, 2020, sees it as cultural warfare. Legacy fragments smuggled to Roman vaults seeding Syriac Renaissance. They sought oblivion ghosts without genealogy, but Isaac's gaze preserved the unburnable faith as ink that flows eternal, defying the pyre's grasp. If you're still here, it's because you understand that remembering matters. What comes next is harder, the machine's unraveling the point where cruelty curves back on itself. You can pause, breathe the air of your own time. But, for those pressing on, let's see this through together to the fracture where empires crack. While Shapur was destroying codices in the mountain fastnesses, he made one crucial error. He aimed his cruelty at the wrong souls, those whose chains hid not just faith, but the embers of organized defiance. The conspiracy brewed in the shadows of the court itself, not a single cabal, but a lattice of defectors, Christian nobles exiled to the frontiers, Roman spies embedded in the postal relays, and disillusioned mobeds who saw the purges devouring the very purity they professed. Foremost among them was Narses, a mid-level chamberlain of 40, once Shapur's favored scribe, his quill drafting edicts with elegant Pahlavi curls. Tall and scholarly, with ink stains perpetual on his cuffs, he'd converted in secret after a sister's martyrdom. In 342, her pyres glow, haunting his dreams. Motivations layered like alluvial silt, Narses sought vengeance for kin, but brought her a vision of reform, Zoroastrianism untainted by blood. Allied with him was General Serena, 52, an Armenian border lord, whose cataphracts had raided Roman supply lines, but whose heart turned after witnessing the isolation, pits the noble's betrayals, turning his loyalty to ash. Serena, broad as a bulwark, with scars mapping old loyalties chafed at the war's drain. Estates razed for pyres, legions mutinying over unpaid grain. Their network spanned couriers like young Tirdad, 24 slipping messages in saddle girths, and a mobed apostate Baram Gushnasp, 60 whose Yasna chants masked Syriac psalms, driven by doctrinal revulsion at the edict's excess. Together, from 370 onward, they wove a plot subtle as spider silk, falsified tallies, underreporting conversions, diverted funds to Armenian rebels, whispers in barracks framing Shapur as Ahura Mazda's fallen shadow. The plot unfolded in whispers across the empire's breadth, a slow uncoiling from Ctesiphon to the Oxus. In 375, Narses smuggled a codex of martyrs' acts to Constantius via Edessa, its pages urging Roman strikes on overextended flanks, the intelligence that sparked the Amida counteroffensive, where legions under Ursicinus reclaimed Nisibis, the prisoners' tales fueling their charge. Serena's defection crystallized in 377 during a blizzard siege at Bazabde. His cataphracts, knee-deep in drifts, turned blades on Sassanid officers, the clash a melee of clanging mail and guttural cries, snow-reddening like a bridal veil. Bahram Gushnasp sowed doubt in temple circles, his sermons twisting Vendidad verses to decry impure kingship, fracturing mobed unity. Tirdad's relays carried the crescendo, a forged edict from Shapur, ordering purges of the purgers, sparking riots in Arbela, where scribes torched their own ledgers. The breaking point crested in the spring of 379 as Shapur, aged 70, lay fevered in his Ecbatana pavilion, after a spear wound from an Armenian skirmish festered pus, seeping like betrayal. Narses entered under pretense of counsel, his vial of nightshade masked as tonic. Present tense grips the moment, April 3rd, 379. The chamber reeks of myrrh and decay, silks draped like shrouds over the canopied bed. Shapur stirs his once eagle eyes dulled, croaking for water. Narses approaches bowl, trembling slightly the liquid dark as ink. "To your health, my lord," he murmurs, tipping it to lips cracked as parchment. Shapur drinks, coughs, then stills breath, halting in a rattle like wind through reeds, body slumping into finality, ended not by blade, but subtlety. No grand theater, just a servant's quiet turn. The aftermath erupted like a fault line splitting stone. Maher Narses fled to Roman lines hailed as hero, but executed years later in palace purges, his codex fragments surviving in Vatican archives. Serena claimed regency briefly only to fall to Hormizd III's counter-coup, his head on a pike along the royal road, eyes left for crows as warning. Bahram Gushnasp perished in temple flames, he himself lit a pyre of contrition. Tirdad vanished into desert sands, his relays legends and Bedouin tales. Power transferred chaotically, Shapur's son, Ardashir II, ascended amid blood, executing rivals in waves that claimed 2,000 courtiers, the empire teetering as Roman legions under Theodosius probed the vacuum. Immediate chaos reigned, satrapies declaring autonomy, Armenian Christians rising in coordinated revolts that seized fire temples the borders aflame, from Indus scouts to Euphrates ferries. Thousands more perished in the scramble, not martyrs, but pawns, their bodies heaped in wadis like discarded chaff. This is what happens when the machine breaks. It devours indiscriminately, gears grinding to halt in a spray of oil and blood. Yet the system survived phoenix-like under reformed edicts that tempered persecution with tolerance, a lesson etched in clay. Cruelty's harvest is rebellion's seed. Shapur's error wasn't the plot's blade, but the alienation that armed it, turning subjects from assets to adversaries, the empire's own weight, its undoing. In the summer of 1985, amid the dust-choked excavations at Tell Brak in northeastern Syria, a team from the British Museum, led by archaeologist Geoffrey Emberling, his face shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat, sweat beading on his brow, despite the dawn chill, uncovered a cache that rewrote the machine's margins. Emberling, then 38, knelt in the trench trowel, trembling as he brushed away layers of silt from a leaden ossuary, its surface etched with a cross superimposed on a fish symbol, the Syriac inscription, Marthana, witness 347, flaking but legible. The air hummed with the site's quiet urgency picks, ringing faintly on flint, the distant bleat of goatherds' flocks, the tang of turned earth mingling with the faint rot of ancient bindings. What they found was no mere relic, but a time capsule, 37 vellum fragments carbon dated by accelerator mass, spectrometry at Oxford, to 340-360, CE, preserving unedited acts of unnamed martyrs, women like Marthana, 24 at her isolation, her testimony raw with details. The hagiographies later sanitized the taste of moldy bread in pits, the echo of guards' boots like approaching judgment. The ossuary sealed with bitumen, plugs intact, held bone splinters scored by cords analyzed via spectrometry, revealing traces of acacia resin from stakes. Emberling felt it viscerally, a chill unrelated to the wind, as if the past exhaled across millennia, the fragments script in Estrangelo letters, flowing like blood from a fresh cut. Published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, 1987. The discovery corroborated the Chronicle of Seared, proving the persecution scale, not legend, but ledger, with radiocarbon margins of Pulwalt-based 30 years, anchoring the horror to Shapur's reign. Why it matters pierces beyond the academic. These shards connect antiquity to our fractured now, teaching that erasure fails when fragments persist. It's not about religion's clash, but power's reflex to silence threats, and the resilience when the silenced refuse oblivion. Psychological insights abound the acts as trauma engineering, breaking spirits to rebuild allegiance, echoing modern interrogations, where isolation yields not truth, but compliance. Parallels sting in current headlines. Uyghur re-education camps mirroring the pits, dissidents' texts burned in digital pyres, urging reflection on complicity, on how denial roams then ours now perpetuates the cycle. Remembering matters because it humanizes the statistic 35,000 not as tally, but as Theclas and Annas, whose resistance seeded global churches. The empire endured 6 centuries, but couldn't efface 18 women's hymns or a bishop's unblinking eye. Think on that power's blueprint crumbles when memory's ink endures. They didn't witness vindication, but left indelible marks, vines twisting through stone, refusing the pruner's shears. Victory redefined isn't survival, but the echo that outlasts the storm. Marthanna was meant to disappear. That was the plan, the machine's elegant calculus reducing voices to vapor histories to haze. But they didn't vanish. They're still here in the vellum scraps unearthed from Syrian, tells their ink faint but fierce resisting time's slow grind, like roots cracking bedrock. In the archives of the British Library that withstood blitz bombs in the clay seals, pried from Ctesiphon's ruins by hands calloused from trowels, not swords. And now they're here with you, in the quiet of this telling, because you chose to lean in, to let their whispers breach the centuries, because you refused to let silence claim the final verse. Brak Mardayalda Dashmaya Marthanna might have murmured in her pit, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," in the Aramaic that tasted of home and heaven. Ashrin la miskene de ruha. You're not just a reader here, you're a witness, and witnesses are the past's lifeline, the breath that keeps bones from dust. To witness is to shoulder the weight, not to gloat in horror's thrill, but to grapple with its mechanics, to see how unchecked suspicion metastasizes into mass graves, how one king's paranoia can orphan generations. These stories matter because they map the fault lines in our own world, the algorithms that isolate dissenters in echo chambers of fear, the policies that tax faith into submission, the denials that cloak brutality and bureaucracy. They connect to today, where refugees from forgotten wars wash up on distant shores, their testimonies dismissed as exaggerations by envoys more concerned with trade deals than truth. What we owe the past isn't pity, but vigilance of vow to name the machines before they were to life, to amplify the Marthannas whose gazes still challenge the void. In remembering, we redeem turning atrocity's ash to fertilizer for justice's bloom, ensuring no pit goes unlit, no edict unchallenged. If this narrative stirred something, a pang for the unscribed, a resolve against erasure, leave a trace below. What line lingered? What echo haunts you? What question burns unasked? These dialogues, these reckonings with shadow, are the forge where prevention tempers. If voices like theirs merit the light, subscribe not for spectacle, but for the silences, yet to shatter the stories still interred, the spirits meant to fade, but flickering eternal. Shapur ruled 4 decades, erected a system blueprinting every future despot's descent into delusion, teaching how to tax the soul until it starves. But neither did the prisoner's defiance dim. Nur al-Nuhra, light upon light. And in that refraction the darkness yields, if only we dare to look.